Hello, everyone, and welcome to Insight Live, the IT Experts Take. So today, I have with me Megan Gentry, who's a senior manager in our AI practice, but basically our AI strategist and delivers all of our AI capabilities. And myself, Carm Taglienti, I will be your host, but also a participant today. You're used to seeing Jason Rader here, so I'm filling in his extremely large shoes to try to drive the conversation with us all today. I am our chief data officer as well as a distinguished engineer and work in the AI space as well. And today we're going to be talking about why you need an AI center of excellence. So we did a little bit of a study on LinkedIn and just to try to understand what people were interested in as it relates to the AI COE. And we found that it was kind of a mixed bag in terms of people that have either built a COE, for example, or are building one, which was kind of interesting. We had no respondents that were currently building one. So we can talk a little bit about that as we go through the conversation today. And then 40% of respondents said that they were unfamiliar with AI COEs and what they were. So we're going to try to demystify some of that as we go. So Megan, let's start off. So let's define what is an AI COE. So we can sort of set the context, and then from there, we'll talk a little bit about our experiences with them.
I love that, Carm. Thank you. So the way that I like to look at an AI Center of Excellence is a set of practices, protocols, and talent that can house the strategy and the delivery of AI solutions in your organization. Sometimes it's fairly centralized. Sometimes it's a little bit more decentralized, where you have that talent and those strategies, protocols coming from different areas of the business. But ultimately, it is your way of moving through time to execute on all of your AI goals. And that could be anything from predictive analytics all the way to Gen AI and some of the cutting edge stuff that we're working on now.
So I think, and that's a great way to characterize what this is. And I think in a lot of ways, the term center of excellence, I think is a little bit scary for a lot of people. So when you hear the term center of excellence, you're like, oh my God, we have to be like exactly perfect in terms of our approach and what we do. And it has to be extremely measurable, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But in general, and I know your experiences with this are this way because I've worked with you and we've talked about this. But in general, we really just want to focus on identifying what those best practices are, as you mentioned, sort of the strategic vision that you want to accomplish, but then an adaptive approach, I think, is the way to do it. So you can create a center of excellence and create the framework by which you would want to, say, become a more AI-enabled organization or to focus in the specific areas of what AI is to you as an organization. Because to every organization, it's not exactly the same thing. It's not always we have to be really good at, machine learning or classical AI, or we have to, maybe train or create our own Gen AI models. It doesn't have to be that. It's going to be different things to different people, but the framework by which you go about it, I think, is the important part. And I know you probably have a lot of experience here too, Megan. So what do you think about sort of that approach? It's sort of the agile approach versus you have to hire, a templated version of, how to do this, put people in the right locations and use draconian control measures to make sure it works. I'm not sure that that's the right way to do it. So what do you think?
Yeah. So I'm working with a client recently who's going through this process and setting up an AI Center of Excellence for the very first time. And they're starting so small, so baby step, that they're not even calling it an AI Center of Excellence yet because the term is quite daunting. What they're starting with, though, is a concept of an AI factory. So they know they have a backlog of use cases. They know they want to work down that backlog of use cases bit by bit and do it in a measured way. But the way in which they define the success criteria, the KPIs and the metrics that are going to inform where to spend our next dollar of investment in talent or technology, that they're biting off one piece at a time. And they're doing that with no more than 3 headcount of folks that they're dedicating to that AI work. And then there's several different business leaders involved in the decision-making of which use cases to start with, keeping it small and then being able to replicate that process of building out a POC maybe to begin with a small reference architecture, then expanding later on down the line to more complicated reference architectures to support some more complicated AI systems.
Right. Yeah, and it's I think that's exactly the way I think a lot of people would think about it. So it's not a build a COE and people will use it. It's more of the create sort of this innovation process within the organization, which embraces AI, and then looks to say, well, what are the core nuggets of information or process that we want to replicate, and then use those to grow and to really turn into a center of excellence around specific behaviors we want to continue to practice in a more effective way. So in those ways, it's not really new, right? So if we think about, historically, we might have had, maybe a data ops practice or a data management COE, and we want to take those behaviors that really are really working well for us and then be able to replicate them. And you described that perfectly. It's sort of they start small, but know what the objective is. So how do, like with most organizations, like when you're working with the customer you were just describing, how do you help them to understand that what you're doing is really the precursor to a center of excellence? And we want to help you to understand how to do that more effectively or repeatably. I mean, is it just a matter of just saying, hey, here's a framework, let's use it? Or is it more a matter of helping to sort of celebrate the positive aspects of what they're doing and then to use that to demonstrate the impact to the organization and then turn that into the repeatable process, which ultimately is the COE?
Yeah. So I like what you said about the celebrating the wins, or the celebration that happens when you are able to make that incremental step forward. Because I think we undervalue sometimes how important that is and how critical that is to executive communication. So one of the things that we see to be a critical, pinch point of, okay, this could either go really, really well for an AI center of excellence, or it could be the nail in the coffin, so to speak, to say, hey, we're not investing in this any longer, is how this first handful of proofs of concepts or pilots go, is how the return on the investment or the project health pulse of communication travels to executive leadership. How are we communicating with our C-level executives around the success of the project? Are we measuring that in a way that is tangible for them, that they can see and forecast exactly how much value that this use case is going to add to their portfolio long term? And are we doing that early? So there are a few practices, tools, techniques that we use to kind of measure that return on that investment very early. Say setting benchmarks or really, really precise success criteria for POCs early when we define them. However, what we've seen to be really beneficial is evolving a stage gate process for moving an AI use case through maturity early and building it as you go, right? Every organization has a different ecosystem of development management tools, things like Azure DevOps, you name it, GitHub. There's all sorts of tools to manage the workflow, and there's all sorts of tools and techniques for managing reporting to a steering committee or to an executive board of guidance for AI strategy. So using the right system of comfortable tools, gadgets, technologies to help bridge that gap between what's going on with development and what's going on with leadership. Setting that stage gate process, which might just be saying, hey, there's 4 stages to get a project to production. You have some sort of intake and evaluation. You might have a POC and experimental phase. You might have a growth phase to see if it would scale. And then you have a production rollout and feedback mechanism phase. If you can generate the right protocols for communication and for, taking a pulse on how we're tracking that work over those phases, we're in a really good place to say, how do we want to evolve that over time to make it even more successful?
Right. Yeah, no, that's and when you were talking, I was really thinking about organizational culture as it relates to not just AI, but certainly the way that you think about innovation or transformation within the organization, because that's a big part of it. So the stage gates, what the expectations are for each one of those stages within the organization. And you also talked a little bit about, which is something I wanted to dig into a little bit more, was who's involved in these centers of excellence. And it's we talk about centers of excellence as probably a moniker for these processes within the organization. And like I said before, sometimes it connotes maybe more of a governance model and like I said, draconian earlier, but we want to avoid that sort of process whereby it's sort of the, thou shalt have a center of excellence, but more focusing on how do we take those processes and then make them supportable within the organization, and just follow the natural tendencies for an organization to want to learn and innovate. And I think in that context, then, and I've seen this in many cases in my own experience, is that when you create centers of excellence, sometimes it's a specific group. In an AI, it's a broader group of people because of the fact that typically AI is more business focused, not just IT focused. But you still do need executive support and executive buy-in in order to be able to get there. You talked about ROI too, and I don't want to make it too complicated a question for us to talk about, but you hit on a number of different really good points. But in terms of participation, I mean, is it the same kind of, like, I'll call it, structure that you would typically see in, these kinds of centers of excellence or governance processes, where executive leadership is a big part of this, and then you have, of course, then each one of the domain owners involved and stakeholders that are really, this is what the business is interested in, this is what IT might be interested in, this is what maybe line level managers or even security teams, et cetera, might be interested in across the board. It feels to me like this is like a whole organizational kind of concept, and really creating those lines of communication like you were describing are important. But how in that context do you think about things like who is accountable, and then how do you enforce accountability? And, not so much racy, could be racy, but it's more of the, who's responsible for the success of this thing, and how do we identify it? And, like, what have been your experiences in terms of getting people to buy in, whether it's executive teams or even, whatever the IT team, to be able to make sure that it can be successful?
Yeah. So success is going to look different to different stakeholders for any particular AI use case. Sometimes we like to think about use cases falling into one of two categories. Like, okay, you've got your big enterprise use cases that are intended to be for, high impact, top line growth, sometimes of revenue, of client engagement, or whatever it may be for the company. And then you've got this whole other area where productivity is going to be affected, and there's IT operations that might be affected, and FinOps, right? So how much your IT is spending on your infrastructure to do these really great enterprise use cases. So a success for one area of the business might be a head scratcher for another. And that's something that we have to weigh early in the decision-making process of which use cases to pursue. So, for example, if you're going for a Gen AI use case that might help you manage contracts better, you are then, ideally going to be speeding up the amount of time, or speeding up the process for getting a contract out to your customer, so that you can engage with them and therefore realize your revenue faster, maybe win more deals with your customers. But on the flip side, it may add quite a bit of work for your IT to manage this new tool, this new AI-enabled application that they're going to have to now manage long-term, make sure is trained with appropriate data from your historical contracts, your new contracts. How is legal going to feel about the situation, right? They're going to have to weigh into this new system as well, as more and more of that work may be abstracted from them and used and may be offloaded to the actual AI system itself. So every use case may have someone that benefits and someone that's like, okay, I want to make sure this benefits me before we jump in with both feet. And it's really, really important for your leaders of your AI Center of Excellence, whether that be something like a steering committee or a group of trusted AI architects from different areas of the business or from IT, to say it's important to weigh all of our options and to consider the pros and cons for each area of the business before we embark on the journey. Sometimes it's an AI architect that fills that role, right? We talk about who is really responsible and accountable. Sometimes it's an architect that could fill that role, but often we find that someone with a little bit of capability to navigate the project or portfolio management side of AI can be really beneficial to sit in that role as well. Hybrid roles are really hard to find, right? Not everyone is a unicorn, but we find that with the right mix of skills and talent between AI acumen and product and portfolio management acumen, we've got a really great spectrum of know-how to navigate that 360 picture of an AI system.
Right. And that's a really good point, because I think in a lot of ways, sometimes when we talk about COEs, people get hung up on the fact that it's like, I need these roles and I have to put people in these roles, but it isn't necessarily a role or a title. It's more of the, what is it that needs to be done in order to create success? And like you were saying, if it doesn't matter who can do it. If somebody in portfolio, for example, can define the business goals and identify the business metrics and ensure that they're enforced or be accountable for those goals, that's great. That's perfectly fine. So I think it's more an identification of what needs to be done to succeed, and then you can align the right individuals to it, but move away a little bit from like the historical governance structures where always you have to have somebody in role X, and a data steward must do that, and an AI steward has to do that, something different, and it gets very complicated then, because then people are like, I can't do that as part of my job. It's too hard, or that's another whatever 50% on top of my 100%. Won't really happen. So that is kind of interesting. So I really like that perspective, which is really what needs to be done, who can fill those roles, and then just make sure that we do have a level of accountability in order to be able to do it, I think. And in the grand scheme of things, then it allows us to be successful. The other thing that I really thought about is going back to the use cases you were describing, because I feel like an AI COE is kind of like a flywheel. You were talking about different use cases to achieve different objectives. And so if we create the, I'll call it the operational processes that allow us to succeed at AI, say methodology or the practice of AI within our organization, then we can apply it to different use cases. And we might tweak it a little bit, but in general, we sort of know what needs to be done in order to be able to, say, apply it to whatever strategic alignment to business goals, for example. If we want to achieve a particular competitive advantage business goal, then we can sort of train the flywheel on how to realize competitive advantage, and then focus on what are those characteristics of call those the operational or center of excellence practices that we want to focus on. Or if it's for operational efficiency of the business, whatever the quality of the data ops pipelines or the data itself, or the accuracy of the resulting AI capabilities, we want to measure that in terms of operational efficiency. Well, we can tune the flywheel to that as well. So I think that's also a pretty cool way to think about it. So it's sort of the use cases to drive the maturity or the perfection of how the flywheel will work. And then you could apply it to other use cases relatively simply as you take them on. And again, more of an agile or, an adaptable strategy and methodology, I think, as we move forward. So you talked about some use cases. So I kind of maybe switch gears just a little bit to, so in your experience, or let's say an Insights experience, I know we have offerings that are related to the COE. So, and while we talk about some of these general concepts, is there sort of a template that you can work with customers to help follow, to say, like you're rattling off a whole bunch of great things that we would want to think about as you sort of look at adapting it to your particular business. So when we work with customers, do we have frameworks which help customers to get up to speed more quickly on creating a COE, and what does that look like?
We do. And I wish I could say it's a 1, 2, 3 step linear process, but it never is. It's very cyclical, right? But we can jump on the carousel at a certain point. And typically that is understanding where our best use cases lie for the next invested dollar. That's what I love to work with, because companies are always asking, right? What do we do next, right? We've got some dabblings of a platform, or we've got some talent, or we have these ideas. Now where do we start? Or what do we dust off and pick back up that we thought might work and didn't? So where we like to start is with some envisioning, right? Some saying, okay, you've got a particular pain point in the business, or you've got some opportunity that's lying there. How could AI help you solve it? Really clarify, what are the technical steps? What's the checklist for launch that you would need to start? What's keeping you from starting today? And what's that compelling reason to get started? Once you have that inventory of AI opportunity at your fingertips, you can then start to model it by how much value is this potentially going to get me, and how feasible might this be, right? Because that's going to take both a business question and a technical question that you can vector towards your teammates and say, all right, we need an evaluation. We need some sort of rating and ranking to apply to our inventory of AI opportunities to tell us where to start next. Let's say we get that prioritization list. We're now ready, potentially, to be able to say, okay, what kind of technology or what kind of resourcing do we need to get it done? Like you said, to your point, it's not necessarily about having every role represented in your team and hiring every role possible. It's about making sure that whatever needs to get done, we have the tools or the people to do it, right? And this is where, one AI system and use case might lean towards implementing computer vision at the edge, and you need some device help, and you might need some security help, and you might need some AI know-how. Whereas another use case that you might prioritize further down your roadmap requires maybe a little bit of a different skill set, maybe deeper data engineering, maybe knowledge of a lot of different systems. Say in manufacturing, you might have like an MES system that needs a SME, a subject matter expert, to help you navigate. There might be a lot of different details that you might need to explore in that realm. So aligning the technology and the resources to your roadmap is usually what comes next. Now, once you've got your plan, or at least the beginnings of your plan, you can begin to execute, or you can pick up execution and augment it. And that's what we like to call that AI factory. It's that now we've got a little bit of a framework to go to. We've got some checkpoints or some stage gates along the way. We know how to communicate the project health against the success criteria. And now our developers are off and running. All they have to do is work the plan. Now, I wish it was that simple. But of course, we have to start the process over, and we have to continue reevaluating as the proofs of concept, the MVPs, the pilots start to give us feedback on whether or not those AI systems work. And that is one critical piece about employing data scientists, AI engineers, et cetera, in your roadmap to work your plan, is there needs to be some sort of feedback mechanism. Mm-hmm. So to really realize what kind of value you're getting out of the AI systems, you need some sort of way to collect that feedback. And maybe it's qualitative, maybe it's quantitative, but those are some of the decisions that you'd be walking down. So again, it's a cyclical framework. It starts over, but once you have an initial roadmap to work with, a lot of it is working the plan.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a great approach, and I have seen it in practice before, and I know it does work really well. And I do like and agree with the perspective on the monitoring or measurement, because I think when we set our objectives for what we expect a COE or even a COE in the context of a particular use case to be, we talked earlier about primarily it's really setting what the business goals and objectives are. It's not really a matter of just saying that we want to do better. And, if that were the objective, then, what we were talking about, I'm not going to say is a Herculean effort in terms of investment of resources, but there are a lot of things that would need to be done. So you have to be pretty serious about creating a center of excellence, or at least creating the type of environment that could turn into a center of excellence. To our earlier point, it's like you don't have to jump in with a monolithic strategy to start, but at least you have to have some degree of commitment. So the ability to measure it, it's kind of like when you start a diet. It's like, you weigh yourself every day, and if you lose a few pounds, you're like, oh, it's working. And then you start commit to something bigger. And that's kind of the way I see this too. If you don't have the ability to monitor, you don't even know if what you're doing is providing any kind of positive impact, qualitative or quantitative. And I think for many organizations that are just starting, I'll call it the easy button is a little bit of the, more of the quantitative metrics, so that you could say, if I'm looking for operational efficiency, then I can basically say, oh, did I reduce the amount of time that it takes to achieve a particular objective within my business? Yes, I can measure that. So you get some really immediate feedback. So I love the monitoring concept, and there are multiple ways to do monitoring. And I know other of our sessions in LinkedIn Live, and maybe we'll come back and talk about this, but I mean, monitoring is probably a whole area we can talk about for quite some time, because there are two different areas of monitoring when we think about AI in the grand scheme of things. There are the AI operational processes, but then there's the performance of the AI solution. And of course, we would love to say everything's Gen AI these days, but it's not, so we do have other kinds of analytical models that we would typically use. And so we have to have the ability to monitor them all within the context of their own subjectivity. So it's sort of if I'm using, a Bayesian algorithm to say measure the performance of, whatever the recommendations for a particular type of diagnosis for treatment, I'm probably going to use more of a sort of a classical algorithm. And then I want to be able to measure the error rates or the error response rates using sort of typical trained and tested models. Whereas in the Gen AI world, we are now coming into this whole world of new ways to measure effectiveness of Gen AI, but it kind of follows the same pattern, just requires a different set of knowledge and expertise. And I think it does fit in well to, what it is that we're talking about. So, that's, I think, really key to all of this. And I tell people this too, because there's a lot of synergies to, and since Jason's not here, I'll talk about cybersecurity because he is the CISO. So, but basically in the cybersecurity side, primarily, even if you don't have policies and ways to be able to defend or protect against cybersecurity attacks, monitoring is the most important thing that you could possibly do. And I would say even in the early days or the nascent stages of an AI center of excellence, it's about monitoring. So if you get the monitoring in place, then you're like, okay, I can see what's happening. You have a little bit of visibility into your environment, and then you can see how these practices that you're starting to create really do impact the outcome. So it's I really think that it's an important part of what you had just mentioned earlier. So if we one of the things I think that from my perspective, and we talked about this before we started today, but when I talk to organizations, I'll talk to them about an AI COE, and they're like, "Oh no, not another COE." And they're like, "I've got a data governance COE, or I've got a data COE, I've got an app COE, I've got an IT COE, I've got a business process COE." So how do we respond to those kinds of things? And it's like, this is different, of course, because we defined how it's different from maybe other COEs, but how is it more collaborative with those other types of COEs as well? And have you seen this in your experience?
Yeah, I think we're building upon existing COEs out there with an AI Center of Excellence. So, for example, with Data Governance Center of Excellence or, Security Centers of Excellence, you have frameworks that are protective to vulnerabilities in your organization, whether it be what kind of data you use and how you use it, or what sorts of traffic you tolerate and how you manage it. AI introduces something brand new, which is how do we influence decision support, or how do we influence the automation of decisioning or activities that are happening on behalf of an organization. And if that doesn't sound like you need governance, additional governance and excellence kind of around it, then take a second look, because there are a whole new set of responsible AI considerations that organizations have to make once they start putting something as powerful as AI at the fingertips of their users. So the implications of not knowing that you're using AI, if you're taking advantage of it in your organization, or if your customers are taking advantage of an AI product that you've released to them and they don't know that, there's a risk to that, right? And so as far as I know, security centers of excellence, data governance centers of excellence, they don't cover awareness of use, which is a whole concept in responsible AI that is part of that framework and part of the AI center of excellence, usually because you're dealing with a new AI system component that you haven't really touched before. So as far as the fear maybe around the bureaucracy that a center of excellence creates, it does not have to be a big, large, monolithic undertaking. It can sometimes be a checklist for, hey, maybe we should ask these questions about the type of AI system we're building before we engage, and just develop a little bit of a plan of how to handle them. Say, for example, when should we retire a training data set? When do we think it might be too old to use or too irrelevant? Or when should we refresh the data that's going in? Who should know about this model and where it's being used? Should our customers know that they're interacting with an AI and not this other system that might be business rules focused or a human being? Questions like that can make a huge difference in how you mitigate risk in the organization when you employ AI algorithms.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a great response. And I think also just sort of adding to what you were saying, if you think about organizations that already have some centers of excellence, if they want to call them that, or practices that sort of are likened to center of excellence, the organizational cultural aspects of how they did it, we can take advantage of as we think about an AI COE. So what has worked for the organization, there'll be the same patterns that work for an AI COE, just as an example. Like we talked about before, did it start as sort of a nascent set of groundswell best practices behaviors that eventually turned into a COE, say for data governance, or did it start as something different? Was it sort of an edict from the powers on high that you must do this? Like sometimes, and it's not disparaging the security world at all, but sometimes you do need sort of that, you need to agree as a corporation to a specific set of policies to enforce. And then the COEs are basically ways to enforce those policies so that, you don't have negative impacts from things like cybersecurity. So there are different ways to approach it. And what works within the organization, we can look at. And adapt to it. So instead of coming in with yet a third way to do it, this is Megan's way of doing it. I'm just teasing you, but it's, this is her way of doing it. And it's like, oh, well, it's different from anything the organization did. So we can then adapt to their existing processes and then also collaborate with them. So the example you were giving about, say, for example, data ops and data lifecycle, some of those concepts were probably already handled as part of not just training sets of data, but also data lifecycles as it relates to, say, data governance best practices. So I think there's definitely a key tie in there in terms of how we treat those centers of excellence, or even if they don't exist, we have to make sure that we at least have those kinds of processes in place overall, and then create really this nice synergistic set of call it COEs, because they are distinct and different, and they have different sets of objectives, which I think is key. So I know in some ways it's sort of it's not another COE, it's more of what is it the COE is trying to accomplish is really the fundamental principles. And we talked a lot about what those are, like use cases, factories, flywheels. So I think that's a really good way to help our audience understand, like, what does this really look like to them, or what should they consider as they think about an AI COE. So probably the last question I'll ask, and it relates more to the organizational aspects of this. It's really more related to like some of what we talked about. And I think I know the answer to this from your perspective, and it probably is going to be, it depends, not to lead you down the path. But when we think about it, like sometimes it's like you want to think about, I need executive support. I want to create sort of within even large organizations or enterprises. Does the COE have to be a sort of an enterprise level concept, or is it federated, or is it more maybe just grassroots? Does it start grassroots, or is there a best practice approach model? Like, I always think about federation versus sort of more enterprise, sort of, I'll call it, authoritative models. But, is there one that you see that works better for organizations, or is that also a maturity in terms of like how you think about who does what as you start to mature in your ability to become a COE?
Yeah. So I wish there was an ideal structure that worked for everyone. So like you said, it depends.
That's a trick question, by the way.
Yeah. But one example that I'm remembering where we thought it was like a really creative way to work this out was to establish a community of practice much more informally for the data scientists to be able, but I'm also talking about other individual contributors that are working directly with data, with customers, with, the bricks and the mortar of an organization, the folks that are going to be generating ideas from the ground up around what could improve the business. Having a sounding board within that community of practice was really valuable when it has an audience to some executive leadership or VP and above leadership that can go and ultimately have an audience with whoever may be able to fund going down those paths. And it's not always obvious in those, senior leadership circles where or how the best way to approach a problem that could be an AI-driven solution is coming from. You need all levels of the organization engaged to some extent, if not to establish what kind of value is tied to a use case, but to figure out truly how feasible is this. is an executive always going to be able to know how accurate is my data in this other area of the business where this process is taking place? Maybe not, but that's a critical question to be answered by someone in a data science or AI community of practice, where they can discuss those things and discuss those technical ins and outs. So I think it has to be both. It has to be somewhat grassroots and a little bit informal in order to get the authenticity to defining what the problem is and how it needs to be solved. But you also need senior leadership engaged to be able to help you figure out how things are going to be funded and how they should be managed ultimately. So is it always, hey, here's a line drawn around who's in the AI Center of Excellence and Community of Practice and who's not? Not all the time. Is it a whole, organizational reporting structure? Not all the time. And we found it actually just to be, just as successful if it's not, right? It's about the processes. It's about what you're doing and how that's communicated, how that's understood across the organization. Is everyone actually aligned on the same goals? Is there duplicated work effort going on in different areas of the organization? As long as you can kind of stamp those problems out, the rest of it has a really great chance of being successful.
Right. Yeah, I love that. That's great. And I think what I love about the response is like what we've been talking about today is more practical and actionable. Like we haven't been really talking about theory. It's like, well, I don't know, it says in this white paper that we should do this. It's more of these are the experiences that we know work as you think about sort of moving into this area. And it's an area that we can't ignore anymore. So like, now that AI is really a part of our entire society and of course the business world by relationship, it's something we must make sure that we look into and start to develop. And actually, I'm really proud today that we only mentioned Gen AI like 4 or 5 times. So that was really good. So normally it's like we say Gen AI all the time. But here's an interesting little question as part of wrap up, and you can give us your final thoughts. But do you think that at some point in the future, maybe we're going to be using maybe agent-based kinds of AI techniques to do AI Center of Excellence and governance for us? Or is that something that really always will require a human? So just love to get your thoughts on that, and then we can wrap up.
I think we're almost starting to see some of that already. I worked with a client that wanted to use their internal facing generative AI LLM to help scan an AI project charter for potential risks and vulnerabilities. So we're already kind of using it to kind of aid our thinking and aid our brainstorming, but it's certainly not a replacement. I think one day the monitoring aspect of AI systems may become more AI driven, which is going to open up a world of self-healing to some of the systems that we're going to be employing. We're probably a little ways out from practical use of that widespread, but it's certainly something that's really interesting to us and that we're starting to play around with ourselves. So yeah, I'm super excited for what the future has to hold.
Yeah, me too. I think it is really exciting. And I do think it's an accelerator, not a replacement. And so it'll help us to do more faster so that it's not a, ho-hum, another AOE. It's more of or COE. It's really more of how can we accelerate our ability to be successful here. So I think that's great. Well, Megan, thank you so much for your time and your wonderful thoughts in this area. And thank you, audience, everyone, for your time today. If you have any questions or would like to learn more, please visit insight.com and we would love to hear from you. Thank you again and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.